I was kind of thinking anyway for the sound quality because I can't
Okay.
get the sound any better with the TV. But I thought if we had another device to pass around, that you could hear them, as long as they're not too close together, because then you get the feedback thing.
Right.
But here Shirley comes.
Lisa,
Mhm.
what you may consider,
Uh-huh.
you can buy at a reasonable price a sound bar or some external speakers that you
Okay.
could connect to your TV. Like I don't use my TV's sound anywhere
You
because
don't.
no, it's just my son's an audiophile, and so he's got us all
Oh.
doing stuff. But even an inexpensive sound
Yeah,
bar,
I'm hearing something.
even
Mhm.
an inexpensive
I'll have
sound
to
bar
look
can
into
give you
it.
much better volume. And it's usually it's just one cable. The newer ones, it's an HDMI cable or just
Okay.
some sort of audio cable. All right.
I'll ask Alex about it if he can't get us one. Yeah. Okay, so here they're gonna have to hold it. See, there is Shirley,
Hi, Shirley.
and there is Shalom,
Hi,
sorry, and
Shalami. How
here
are
is
you?
Phyllis.
Nice to see you again. Been a long time.
You remember Phyllis?
All I see is
No.
Shalami right now. So, um,
Oh no, that's Phyllis. This is Shalom.
oh, there she is. Great. With mask, I can't tell. Okay, now I see. Okay.
Phyllis, yeah.
Hi,
Okay.
Phyllis. Hi, Shalami. I'm sorry. With mask, it's okay.
We all
So,
say who we are.
okay, we will do the best we can with the phone.
Okay, I'm still working on the laptop while you're out here, so.
Okay, so, ladies, I hope you're doing well. Have you been have they started giving you all vaccines yet?
Yeah. Had our first first dose.
Good, good, good. So maybe
Yeah.
when you're vaccinated, I was able to get vaccinated. My mother-in-law lives in an independent living high rise, and they vaccinated everyone. There was some staff who didn't want to take it, and they had extra doses. And rather than throw them away, they said to family, "Look, if you're here at the end of the day, you can get vaccinated." So we'll have to find out when all of you are vaccinated, and when I am vaccinated, maybe they'll let me in the building. We'll see.
That's the hope, yeah.
February 16th?
That's
Did they say that?
That's around the second dose time, yeah.
I'm scheduled to get my second dose on February 12th, and
Oh,
they say 2 weeks afterwards you're as protected as you're going to be. They still recommend wearing masks, but we'll see. I'll talk to Lisa. So this is going to be a little hard on the phone because I had some slides I wanted to share with you. I will share them anyway, and I'll talk you through them. If there's anything that's not clear, please speak up so I know, and I will try and go back and make it clearer. Most of the stuff you don't necessarily need to see, but we'll go. Okay.
History of the women's movement.
So this is, and I'm recording it. I don't know if Lisa or Amanda shared the last of our classes.
no, our touchdown's
this
been
is-
down, so I haven't been able to show it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm recording this today. So this is a mini class on the history of the women's movement in the United States. And we talked about there's lots of periods, lots of ways of slicing it, but there were three major periods that I wanted to look at. One was the early 1900s leading up to the women getting the right to vote. Talk about the suffragettes and the impact they had on American society and culture. What I want to talk about today, and I'm suspecting we'll go into our next lesson also, is what we call the crisis years. That is from the Great Depression through World War II. We see American society in general changing significantly. We see the role of women changing significantly as well. Some of these changes endured, some were thought of as being short-term in response to the crises, and how the society reacted to those differences, meaning the men thought, great, the crises are over, women go back home. The women going, great, I like being in the workforce. I like earning money. I like being independent. I like being respected. We need to talk itself raised some interesting issues. And the third period we'll look at deals with the civil rights era and generally the movement towards greater women's right, including the push for the Equal Rights Amendment, which I just read last week. There's some members of Congress want to reintroduce a law that would allow it to be reconsidered. So anyway, let's look at the crisis years. And when I think about this period, I want to throw out throughout our discussion today, and please, if you have questions, you have observations, speak up, shake the phone so I see if I don't hear you. I don't like being a talking head, which is what you tend to be on Zoom. But we'll have lots of questions I'm going to throw out, but there's 3 meta questions for this period. I want to have us have in mind and sort of shape generally our discussion about this time period. First, what were the key issues facing the women's movement during this era? Secondly, could the pushback against the gains made by women have been anticipated? Should it have been? Right, we're going to talk about the pushback. And I think we live, at least for myself, when I look at the events of the last year, 2 or 3, it's clear that some of the pushback on both sides of the political spectrum should have been anticipated, and we should have been prepared for that. And shame on certain individuals or governmental agencies who are not prepared for that pushback. And the last thing is, are we seeing attempts today to roll back social and economic gains by women? If so, by whom and why? And the truth is, we can ask these meta questions for all 3 eras. And one of the things I want to keep circling back to is what's implied in this last question, meaning, are we still fighting some of the same battles that women fought 60, 70, even 100 or 150 years ago? And if so, why is that the case? So let's talk about backlash. I'm using it as a general thing. And backlash in respect to the dramatic changes in society. So we all know the stock market crash in 29 was a stunning blow, not just to the country, but to the cause of women's rights. Few people had an interest in the careers of women at the time, the new women. Men couldn't find jobs. The male breadwinners were losing jobs at an unprecedented rate. So if the men aren't working, you're really going to fight to get women jobs? And frankly, again, if we look for parallels, the reports and studies I've seen, and you've probably seen it also, that women's employment has been much more sharply impacted by the pandemic than men, especially with school closing. Schools close, who's going to watch the kids? Well, the expectation is mom will leave her job so dad can keep working. So, some things never change. And even more so, the economic downturn actually unleashed a really vicious backlash. I'll give you some examples against working women. So I'm going to give you one example. In 1932, Congress passed Section 213 of the Federal Economy Act, which prohibited more than one family member from working for the federal civil service, right? So if your husband worked for the post office, you couldn't get a government job. That's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Of course.
No.
Right? Now, this law was written in a gender neutral manner, at least on paper, but everyone understood what it was. It was aimed at the wives. If the husbands worked for the government, the wives couldn't. By the time this law, this Section 213, was repealed in 1937, 1,600 federal women workers have been forced to resign. That's not a huge number, but it's not an insignificant number. Certainly not insignificant if you needed that money to feed your family. We see more broadly that there were public opinion polls that showed widespread opposition to working women. Again, there was this opposition. We talked about it in the last lesson, and it just got stronger as men were out of work. For example, 1936, when asked whether wives should work if their husbands had jobs, 82% of respondents to a Gallup poll, including 75% of all women, said no. right? By today's perspective, that's astounding. Many men held to this view even in the face of their own unemployment. Didn't matter to some of these men if they didn't have jobs. By God, they didn't want their wives working either. And in fact, I would say, and we'll have some examples to show, that for some men, it was even more imperative that their wives don't work if they didn't work. I mean, what did that say about you as a man? You couldn't find a job and your wife could.
Yeah.
Here's some quotes that I gleaned from the books I used to put this together. I would rather starve than let my wife work. I would rather turn on the gas and put an end to the whole family than let my wife support me.
Oh, God.
Okay? This is crazy. To allow a wife to work would mean that a man had relinquished his last hold on patriarchal authority, his claim to manhood.
Macho man.
Yes. Yeah, and I look, you may not agree with it, but I think we've heard of such a mindset. You know, we live, I think, in a time it's much more rare, but you know, it from, again, we look back from 2021, it sounds really crazy. This battle also went down to the state and local level. In half the states, bills were proposed to prohibit hiring of married women for any job. It wasn't just women, but it's specifically married women. Why? Because married women are supposed to be home taking care of their husband and their kids, right? So most women accepted as prejudice. So Lisa, I think you're going to have a problem.
Because it's too close.
Well, you're going to have an echo.
Yeah.
You're gonna have
I'll turn off my phone.
Use a very bizarre futuristic sound effect with all the echoes, you know. Okay, so most women accepted this prejudice against the working wife, not out of concern for men's psychological vulnerability, but because most women were either housewives and therefore dependent on their husband's earnings, or they were single, widowed, deserted, or divorced working women for whom the married woman represented unwelcome competition. All right, so think about it. So if you were married, and your husband said you can't work, you couldn't work. We're not even talking about the pressures you might have felt to have to take care of the kids. And if you were single for whatever reason, working women, married women were competition. So married women were getting opposition from both ends of the spectrum, as it were. So one of the things to think about when we're talking about the beginning of this period, 29 and through the 30s, did these women have jobs or careers? So what do you think? Would you define what they were doing as jobs or careers?
My mother-in-law, taught for those years.
You might have to talk a little louder, Shirley.
What?
Can you hear her?
Barely. You know what you might want to do is mute the TV and turn on the phone. And that way when they want to answer and they speak, it might be easier to hear.
Okay. Okay, so I am muting that.
All right, is the phone on? Can you hear me? Oh, I have to let you back in. Hang on, okay. How about now?
Okay. Oh, it still has it, even though I'm muted.
Well, let's just try that. So, so I asked, what do you think, jobs or careers?
How did you talk to him?
My mother-in-law, who had come from the waste.
Go ahead.
Lisa, turn down the volume on your computer or your TV.
I muted it. The TV is off.
Well, just go ahead. We'll listen to the echo. We'll make it work. I'd rather hear you with an echo than not hear you at all.
My mother-in-law uh, came from Lithuania area. She was very well educated, and when she came to America, knowing many languages, she got a job as teaching in the public high school.
Okay.
And it was very fortunate that she did, because her husband, who was a Shakespeare expert, started a school for foreigners in English, but he wanted to, he really did, he wasn't successful at it.
Okay.
But my mother-in-law worked all those years during the Depression. She was unusual.
Yeah. So I think, I think the reality is women like your mother-in-law existed in the sense that there were women who had careers. But when we think about careers, I think we presume that there's training and education that women often didn't get. A very small percentage of women were going to college. Some were dropping out of high school to get married. And in response, especially we'll see in at the start of World War II, a lot of these women started in jobs. Some of them were just, and to me, I think that the point I'm trying to make here, the jobs were not necessarily planned for. Suddenly, the Great Depression hits and you need money. Suddenly, World War II hits and there are hundreds of thousands of men no longer available in the workforce, so women have to step up. And if you want to push back and reclaim, I think it's easier to push back or reclaim jobs than it's careers. It's harder to say to a teacher, well, you just stepped up to teach in an emergency, now go back home. Teaching was a career, but we also know that teaching as a profession was historically and still is underpaid because it was women's work. If you look at anything that was historically women's work, salaries were lower than you would expect. And that we'll talk more about that wage differential as we go on. Well, let's continue talking about backlash. So to your point about your mother-in-law, even in professions like teaching, where women's place had long seemed secure, the Depression brought a backlash. Sorry. For example, in 1931, 81% of all teachers were women, but by 10 years later, by 1940, only 75% were women. Not a drop, but a significant drop. So women were either being pushed out of the workforce, or men who had other jobs and needed work, they thought, I'll be a teacher. So easy to be a teacher. Having been a teacher is not true, but everyone who's never been a teacher thinks teaching's easy. In 1929, 39% of teachers would hire married women to work as teachers. By 1931, that figure fell to 23%. Okay, so you see these statistics are underscoring and showing the trends that there was pushback, there was backlash. Men were out of work; they didn't want their wives working either. So the bias against married women was not universal, because we have this other figure. By 1940, 35% of women who worked were married, compared to 29% in 1930. So, I think what this shows us, you had competing tensions. On one hand, there was pressure, don't work, you got to stay home, how can you work when your husband's not, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, you got to pay bills, you got to feed your kids. And by 1940, you're probably also beginning to see the beginning of the ramping up of the war effort. All right, so married or not, women of color, strong bias against women of color. For example, in Texas in the 1930s, the weekly wage of a white factory woman was $7.45. Chicanos took home, Latinos took home $5.40. A black woman only made $3.75. And these sort of wage disparities still exist. That's why you had minimum wage laws put into place. That's why the current administration is proposing to raise the federal minimum wage to try and deal with such disparities. When you look at these trends, so you have a clear bottom line. The lower the wages, the less prejudice against working women, okay? And that's still true. Look, if we think about our current times, and in some states, some regions, strong bias against immigrants. But I say this factually, and don't mean to say it pejoratively in any way, shape, or form, but as long as I can remember, when I see new house construction in Atlanta, I see Mexican men and Latinos on the roofs and doing the really miserable jobs. I don't see white men. If you think about the poultry plants that we have in North Georgia, right? They are immigrants because they're miserable jobs, low-paying jobs. You know, can you imagine being on a roof in the summer in Atlanta putting black shingles on? Okay, so they're low-paying, lousy work, and low-paying, lousy work. You don't care that a person of color or an immigrant or a woman gets that job because you don't want that job. And that's true even today. So in the end, what mattered most was not a woman's marital status, but a willingness to work for a wage no man would accept. Okay. And so I've already answered. Wage difference, do they continue to exist today? Yeah, there's studies. It's complicated in the following sense. The studies show, I don't remember the exact figure. I should have looked it up. I've seen it. At one point, it was 69 cents to the dollar, female versus men. I think it's either 71 or 75 cents to the dollar, female versus men. Part of that, in fairness, part of that's explained by family leave. In other words, part of the average salary for women is impacted by women who may take a few years out of the workforce to be home with young children and then come back. But that's only a small part of it. In industry after industry, women are paid less than men, even today. You know, if you look, for example, at current graduation rates at law schools and business schools, half or more of the graduating classes in law school and business school are women. But if you look at top corporate jobs or number of female partners in leading law school firms, it ain't 50%. Let's just say that. Not even close. So if we summarize, by the end of the decade, meaning by the end of the 1930s, anxiety about the forgotten man had overwhelmed concern for the new woman. Okay, so all the gains, not all, but much of the gains that the women had made up to the Great Depression were overwhelmed because of, oh, these poor men who lost their work. Those who argued on behalf of women workers, they stopped talking about a woman's right to work. Instead, they were starting to use language like their need to work. Okay, that's a very, very different article, one that does not empower women at all. It's okay for women to work when they need to work, but they have no right to work. Changes the argument, makes it easier to push back and try and reclaim the jobs from women. Now, you did have occupational segregation, meaning there were certain women's work, all right? And so you had people who were trying to oddly protect women's ability to work, ignored the advice of feminists. Feminists said, you got to stop thinking about women's work. There's just work. There's just work. But at a time when you're trying to make sure women could keep jobs, to say that teaching was limited to women, well, that gave them a protected field. You know, so in the short term, it might have been a good strategy or tactic, maybe even a necessary one, but it wasn't smart in the long term. They were getting, so what they were telling women at this time was, if you're going to look for a job, try and find a job where you're not going to compete so much with men. You'll be more likely to get hired if you're not competing against men. You won't face the backlash. Today, of course, we don't say such things. You know, when I taught high school students, and I would point out to them, my mother and my mother-in-law, had they been looking for work in the 60s, they had two separate help wanted sections for men and for women. They were jobs that were listed, men only. They couldn't understand it. So this strategy protected women in the short term, for sure, but it ensured an inferior economic status for a long time. Again, I always point to teaching as an example. It was a protected woman's field, and teachers got paid bupkis. Nurses got paid bupkis until there was a shortage and started getting men to be nurses. Nursing is now is a high-paying field now, but for the longest time they were paid very poorly. So let's use the filter of making do. Okay, so what did you do? How did you make do? You couldn't find work, but you know what? You could always find work as a housekeeper. People with money always wanted women to clean or cook or wash clothes, so you could find money. So they went, and what did they do in their own homes? They canned, they baked, they started planting vegetable gardens. They were fixing old clothes, things people are doing today. You don't go to the doctor. You move to a smaller apartment with lower rent. You heat only one room. So then they cut off electricity and telephone. Today, you would get rid of internet. God forbid you should think about getting rid of the cell phones, right? But you make do. So to bring in extra cash, women sometimes took in boarders. They did laundry, they did sewing. So they did what they could do. They needed to have income. They couldn't find work outside the home, so they made do. By the way, I've used this presentation for a long time, and I'm just realizing that I spelled do, D-U-E, not D-O. Shame on me. Economic pressure brought not only redoubling of efforts by women to make money, but you had to return to extended family arrangements, right? What does this mean? You had 11, 12 members of an extended family living in one 3-room dwelling. Look, my father, it was post-depression, it was later, but my father's family was not so well off. And when he met my mother, he was a police officer in Miami Beach. And he worked the night shift. I remember him telling me he worked the night shift because there wasn't a bed for him to sleep in at night. They had, he had his mom and dad, he had a brother, and they had a couple uncles, I think, living with them. And so dad worked at night, and he came home in the morning, he kicked somebody out of bed so he could sleep. So you can imagine. And we see that today in low income families, that you have lots of people crowded into small dwellings. Now, I think we'd all understand, and we see it in the pandemic, even though it's not necessarily financial. When you're forced to have a lot of people in close quarters, it may bring families closer, but it could also have a very detrimental impact on families. Right? In this time, we're talking about the late 20s, early 30s, it discouraged young people from marrying. Okay, how could I get married? I can't make a living. I can't support my wife. So the marriage rates plummeted and didn't start rising again until 1934. Now, I brought this chart because it's interesting, I think, to compare the present to the past. I didn't update the charts. I should have. The charts are 10 years old, but I think the trends are still there. You've got marriage rates falling, all right, but very different reasons. In the late 20s, early 30s, people still wanted to get married. They weren't because they couldn't afford to, or thought they couldn't afford to. Today, I think people are deferring marriage to later ages. They want to set up careers. You have less people interested in being married. There were certain tax disincentives for married couples versus single couples. So we shouldn't jump to the conclusion and say, oh, just like in the early 30s, marriage rates were falling because of financial considerations. That's what's driving in here too, right? So that would be a simplistic analysis, but it's part of it, I think, and we'll perhaps touch on this in when we look at the later period. Part of the decline in marriage is a reflection of women's rights and independence. Women could, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, going forward, women can say, I don't have to get married. You know, I have life choices that my mothers and grandmothers didn't have. If I want to get married, I can. If I don't want to get married, I don't have to. My identity as a woman need not be limited to that of wife and mother, which is not to say there's anything wrong with having an identity as wife and mother, but you have changing economic and social factors going on. Another expected consequence, you had fewer people getting married. They're having fewer children, right? If you can hardly feed mom and dad, you're certainly not going to have 3 or 4 kids, right? More than 25% of women who were born in the first decade of the 20th century, who meant they were between 20 and 30 at the beginning of the Great Depression, meaning bearing age, what would have been then considered prime childbearing age, 25% never had children. Never had children. A higher rate than that had ever been or has been since. So you see the impact the Great Depression really did have on family. You had increased reliance on contraceptive. You had increased numbers of abortions during this time period because people couldn't afford kids. At that time, state laws permitted abortion only to save the life of the mother. But you had doctors doing a lot because they saw it as a legal loophole. And you can imagine those days, TB, diabetes, a lot of diseases back then, which thank God are not so life-threatening anymore, were. So doctors took that as license, a loophole. Woman's got TB, they would do it. If this was a social issue class, we could have a long, complicated discussion about what's gone on with abortion rights and the great, debate over abortion that rages in our country even today. Then as today, right? Those who couldn't afford legal abortion, they found whatever means they could. Right? This is I quote from this book I used. They turned to back alley abortionists in those filthy rooms. Women risked their health and not infrequently their lives. You know, it still is. Now, this raises a question again worth thinking about as you have increased restrictions on legal abortions. And this chart ends in 2010. The restrictions have gotten even much stricter at a state level. The Supreme Court has given states more leeway than some would like to put restrictions on a woman's right. And I think the reality is that a woman who wants an abortion, I'll say it differently. Rich women can always get an abortion and get a safe abortion. All right. Poor women who want an abortion, need an abortion, they'll find a way to do it. And whether it's risky or not. So I think the figures would show that the more restrictions, the more illegal abortions you're having. Now, we had another detrimental impact of the Depression and the family circumstances. Husbands just disappeared. Couldn't support the wife and kids, and they just disappeared. Pressed financially, a growing number of husbands just abandoned their wives and children. They didn't even seek a divorce because it cost too much money. They were there one day and gone the next. Here's some statistics. In 1930, 12.7% of all households had female heads. By 1940, 15% did. Okay, it's a boost. It's a boost. Now, families who weathered the storm, meaning they probably had, if you had good relations before the Depression, you tended to have less negative impact. And again, I think about the pandemic. People my friends, my colleagues, people I talk to, they get along. And those who got along well with their spouses, their kids, they're doing better than those. If you had a strained relationship with a spouse or a child, and you've been on lockdown for 6, 7, 8, 9 months, not good, not good. And that was certainly the case then. But what's interesting to me, at least, and I would argue that in a lot of cases it hasn't changed, the traditional role is still stuck, meaning the husband lost his job. He was home. He didn't clean. He didn't cook. He didn't do the laundry. That was wives' work, right? So think about how much tougher it was for the woman. He's not working. He's sitting home. She had to work and still take care of the kids. And you guys know better than me, perhaps. Washing back then was a major issue. I may have mentioned this before. It always stuck with me. I've seen people make the argument that one of the greatest boons to the women's movement was the invention of the washing machine. You didn't have to spend the whole day doing wash, right? I put up wash this morning. I'm going to go down when this class is over and fold the wash, right? I could do all kinds of things while the wash machine's running. So this is a chart that I wanted to show that the more things change, the more they don't. This is tracking parents' time in housework from 65 to 2011. Mothers' time decreased by almost half because I think they're working more. But look at the disparity, it's still there. Men went from 4.4 to 9.8. I mean, they're doing more, but I think it's better. My daughters are in their early 30s, mid 30s, and their husbands help more. And I think they help more than my peer group. I'm more finicky. I do more of the cleaning than my wife does, but I think we're the exception. So this trend that the women that we saw in the Great Depression, it's tempered somewhat, but it's still in place. Still in place. So here I put up the average number of hours per day spent on housework, childcare, and leisure. Okay. So during the weekday, housework, women 2.4 to 1 hour for men, childcare 2 to 1. It's during the weekday, it's about the same. I'm going to guess leisure is may largely be TV, but on the weekend, the women are still doing more housework. They're still doing more childcare, and husbands get an hour more. I love the icon at the golf course the women get. Let's continue with making do. So maybe, and this is what this book that I turned to suggests, that women often did better psychologically than men, in part because their traditional roles were preserved. If you traditional role was wife, mother, caregiver, you still were. If your role and sense of self was defined by your job and you lost your job, it was hard. But they didn't gain power. They didn't get power as a result of it. Right? This research study claimed that even within the families, women found it more difficult than ever to assert their rights. And it could be that the men were home, they felt their masculinity under assault, so they wanted to be the man of the household. We'll go. Do you guys have time? Do we have to stop at noon, or can we go a little longer because we started?
Which one?
Noon.
Lisa, is she there? So until Lisa comes back and takes her phone, we'll keep going, because I know sometimes y'all have events. Do you have time to stay? Do you want to go another 10 or 15 minutes, or do we need to stop?
I want to leave about 5 minutes to get my sleep.
Okay, so you know what? Let's do this. This is a good logical stopping point, because it's starting a new section. I will send this I recorded today's session. I will send it to Lisa and Amanda to post. If they post them, if you want to go back, the last session was recorded. It was a less dense section. We were able to get it done in an hour. Is that Rabbi Lindenblatt? Hi. How you doing? We're finishing up right now, Rabbi Lindenblatt. So, okay. So I hope to see you guys in 2 weeks, and hopefully they'll have the technical difficulties, and encourage Lisa to get an external speaker to the TV. It'll make everybody's life much better. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Take care all. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.